Everyone, and thanks again for spending some of your time this afternoon. If this is your first session or your fourth today, we're glad you've been able to attend our 2025 second day of the Nonprofit Virtual Conference. I'm still John Fadis, one of the leaders in our assurance practice of the Cherry Beckert Nonprofit Group, and I'm based in Chicago. And it's been a pleasure to be your MC today for all the sessions. Today's final session is related to ERP Systems Consideration for Nonprofits. An ERP system serves as the backbone of the organizational operations, integrating and automating critical processes across the enterprise. This session will guide you through key steps for selecting and deploying the right ERP solution to maximize value and risk. And pleased to introduce our two speakers for the final session of the day. We got an encore presentation from George Delpret. He was on our first session this morning on a different topic, and he's joined by Jim Holman. Both of them are in our Cherry Beckert Digital Advisory and Technical Advisory Service practices. And I'll pass the baton over to Jim and George.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is George Delpret, as John said, and I'm a managing director in our advisory practice. I lead our analytics and automation team, and I have about 3+ decades working on large-scale technology modernization projects, many of them ERP-related, billion-dollar-plus programs affecting 100,000+ users at large federal organizations. I've worked with not-for-profits as well. And Jim and I have the pleasure of working together on lots of ERP advisory projects where we help clients figure out how to move from an old system that's no longer supported to a new one. So we're going to talk about some of the things that we've learned that you should keep in mind as you're thinking about new systems. Jim, quick introduction, and then we'll kick it off.
Sounds good, George. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Jim Holman, as it says there. I was this morning, and I will be at the end of the day a director within CFO Advisory Services. So working with mid-market and growing organizations, including public sector and not-for-profit, trying to make sense of how to align their organizational needs to service their constituents and stakeholders with their technology, ERP being the prime driver of that. So we're happy to be with you today.
All right, thanks, Jim. We're going to start with a polling question. These are important to get your CPE credit. Do you believe your current ERP will effectively serve your organizational needs over the next 3 to 5 years? Yes, no, or what is an ERP? So let's see how folks answer this one. We should start seeing results shortly. Great, the majority are very comfortable with the ERP systems. 34% of you that are out there are going to need to be thinking about a new system, and hopefully some of the things that Jim and I share today will help you, as well as the 23 of you that don't know what an ERP system is. We'll hopefully answer that question too. So let's go ahead and jump in quickly. So as we think about ERP solutions, it's really the core ledger of your finances and operations. And there are a lot of pieces to it that touches the core pieces of the ERP environment, as well as third-party solutions or systems. Sometimes they could be an integrated part of an application, but really the things that help you run your organization. So in the middle, we've got the core ERP, got your general ledger, the financial reports that you need. Sometimes it's got budgeting and financial planning modules. You can track revenues that come in from your donors and the expenses, payables for the vendors that you use, and cash management. And then in the outer circle, these are a variety of different things that tend to be connected to the ERP system. HR and payroll, sometimes you might have an integrated platform that does that. And then a lot of these other solutions may be integrated, but they're more likely to be third-party solutions. So your donor CRM system, how you track each of your donors, who they are, your interactions with them. Grants management's a big part of the not-for-profit environment. Requesting grants, processing grants, getting grants approved, tracking grant dollars, volunteer management, program management, online giving, events, member portals, and campaign management. It's a complicated, inter-networked system that connects the ERP and your core financials to your operations. So that's what we're really going to talk about today is the core ERP system. And when you get ready for an upgrade, some of the things that you need to keep in mind as you're planning. So many folks, probably the folks that said they're not going to make it through the next 3 to 5 years, have to start thinking about where to go with a new ERP system. And they're probably struggling with some of these pain points with old ERP solutions. And a lot of times those old solutions create a lot of operational inefficiencies or have some limits on organizations that make it difficult to operate. Maybe you don't get access to the financial information when you need it, or you don't have the reports that you need. Sometimes you may not have an integration to another system. So let's take an example of HR and payroll. If that's not integrated into your financial system, you're going to have to double key payroll information every time the payroll gets processed and goes out. You might have limits to certain pieces of data from the organization that aren't part of the ERP system because it's really shut off and that data is stovepiped. Administrative inefficiencies, which is double keying, entry keying information in. We've seen that with several customers that have old solutions. The lack of integration requires double entry. You may have compliance or regulatory challenges because the way you set up the ledger back in the day didn't comply with the latest Gatsby or latest regulations. They're also, in older ERPs tend to be more difficult to support technologically. A lot of them are on premise, so in your walls, and you have to have servers and firewalls and all sorts of the infrastructure and equipment to be able to support that, and maybe even a hands-on team that has to support those things. And that often is common with old ERPs. And it can create resource constraints just with the difficulty of trying to manage requests that come in around the ERP system. So those are some of the things that we typically see with organizations that have older ERPs. ERP has evolved quite a bit since it first started in the early 70s and 80s. I remember my first job was working for the Air Force in, I guess, the early 90s, and we used a client server architecture on an old WAN system terminal, and all the financials were there in a centralized on-premise solution, and we were only able to access that through our monitors, but all the information was stored back there in that client server and architecture model. That's not the way things are done today. Then we moved into web-based ERP solutions, as the cloud came about in the early 2000s. And in 2010, we start to see cloud-based ERP solutions and models and SaaS. So software as a service is what SaaS stands for. Models where instead of having to buy the servers and the hardware and all the infrastructure and put it inside your organization's walls, you basically subscribe to it. You pay a service. Like you do for a streaming Netflix, solution right now. And Netflix charges you a service for that. Same thing in ERP solutions right now. And now we're seeing more advanced cloud-based solutions now. But most of the popular vendors have moved not 100% away from on-premise, but more so to cloud-based SaaS offerings. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim, who's going to talk about some common ERP challenges for not-for-profits. Jim.
Yeah, thanks, George. So not-for-profits face unique challenges that the commercial organizations or public sector doesn't necessarily face to the degree that NFPs do. So we want to help you over the next, 10 or so slides, understand a little bit more about what those challenges are, what organizations run into, and we hope that this will make you feel like you're not alone in having these challenges and troubles within the system, your systems of record. What you'll see is earlier when George was talking about issues and problems with old ERP platforms, is what we find is these challenges are even more difficult when your technology is really 10, 15, 20 years old. And this is where you're going to see the lack of flexibility cause more manual efforts. And it's really, at the end of the day, going to be harder to serve your constituents. So let's look at these first challenges. The first is going to be fiscal year timing considerations. So, old ERPs sometimes struggle to have a non-calendar year fiscal year, and it's pretty common, almost exclusively, for NFPs to have a non-calendar year. But it's also going to be really important to align with grants as well. The system that you choose really needs to align with those grant cycles and schedules appropriately. So within the reporting structures that are going to support budgeting and planning and compliance, you're really going to need that flexibility and malleability. NFPs face this all the time, and that's a real challenge when working with an existing system, as well as picking a new system that maybe isn't designed for NFPs. So really, timing the implementation is really going to be critical to avoid busiest operational periods. Why is that? It's because NFPs tend to have staffing and resourcing challenges. If you're putting in a new ERP platform, it's going to be really important to align when you're going to cut over. But remember, you don't have to go live at the start of your calendar year, of your fiscal year. You can go live during your fiscal year. And these are things that was just unheard of, 10 years ago plus. You weren't able to do that. You had to go live at the start of your fiscal year, which meant that a lot of NFPs were cutting over when they really weren't ready and had a miserable time of their first 6 months or so until they were able to right the ship. So if you're looking for, say, key actions, early planning with stakeholders. We want to avoid operational disruptions during critical periods. We want to time our go live appropriately. It doesn't have to be at the beginning of your fiscal year. And then really to understand how do we best appropriate resources to make our timing and our training of our key people conducive of a successful project. All right, challenge number 2 is grant reporting and site-specific needs. So what do we do with regards to compliance as it relates to grants? Is that how do we establish specific reporting frameworks at the beginning of our project so that everything is set up so that we don't have pinch points and emergencies and burning the midnight oil to be able to report as we are required to do so. So what do we do about multiple sites and regions that potentially have different reporting requirements? How do we understand what that looks like, and to make sure that we are not dumping data out to Excel to manually process and report? So some implementation tips as it relates to grant reporting is modern ERPs within the NFP space really are able to use data segmentation and dimensional strategies within the chart of accounts to enable you to do those reporting across grants, across funds, across individual donors and campaigns, so you can really help to manage your compliance and the effectiveness of your investors. Early testing ensures that you're going to meet all of your grantors' requirements without disruption. What does this mean? It means that the flexibility of the reporting systems within the ERP platforms are going to help you do this right out of the box, as opposed to customizations or manual data exercises. And then lastly, consider using multi-site tracking. How do we make sure that we're able to manage the unique requirements of multiple sites, different states, perhaps different countries as well, without expecting a one-size-fits-all approach? These are all important things to go and understand more about as you start a new project. So challenge number 3, fund accounting complexity and stakeholder reporting. A little bit related to the top, depending on what your donors require, but restricted versus unrestricted funds, they must be separated and tracked accurately. So these are all things that you can configure within new software. If you're finding that these things that we're talking about are incredibly difficult for you today, you may have been in one of the 38% of the people that responded to that first polling question with you're not sure if your ERP solution is really going to be able to lead you over the next 3 to 5 years. These are all things that might start to stack up that these challenges are real for you. So project-based tracking is essential for clear accountability to all the stakeholders. We think that you should be building donor transparency into your reporting templates from day one going forward. So what do you need to do to not just have your summary totals, but to be able to build your reporting templates out for donors and compliance needs that has the detailed viewpoints? Next, some key points to consider is to look at your finance and your program leads must collaborate on tracking and reporting. It's fundamental to nonprofit accounting and shouldn't be overlooked, or you're going to have trouble with escalations, support issues, and ultimately a degradation of trust. All right, donor management integration. So this was something that is relatively new, whether you're using something like Razor's Edge, Salesforce, other donor management systems. Essentially, it's a nonprofit CRM, and it's connected to your ERP system. So what do we do with regards to addressing these types of challenges? So donor data must sync accurately with financial records at all times. It's not good enough to wait until compliance reporting comes up or until month end. Ultimately, you're able to integrate to your donor management systems in near real time, or at least on a daily basis. So configuring contribution and allocation tracking early in the implementation is going to be key. And we recommend strongly using sandbox environments or a test environment for thorough testing of integration and data flow. So data flow accuracy is critical for effective donor stewardship and reporting, and poor integrations cause ongoing reconciliation nightmares and frustrated staff members. So it's a great opportunity to connect your donor management system to your ERP, but go into it understanding that if you don't go in the right way, or you trust your vendor too completely without verifying the quality of the results in a sandbox, you could really be connecting two systems that are just not ready to go through a live integration test. All right, polling question number 2. So we're going to test some knowledge about the number one reason for ERP implementation failure. So you may say, we haven't really talked about this. But if we go through some of the challenges that NFPs go through and old ERP weaknesses and inefficiencies, let's see what the answers come up to be. So number one reasons, as you can see there, is A, lack of leadership commitment, B, poorly defined system requirements, C, insufficient training and change management, D, inadequate budgeting and resource allocation. All should see your questions coming up. All right, insufficient training and change management. Let's say yes, and a close number 2 is the lack of leadership commitment. Those are flipped within commercial and not-for-profit, because ultimately leadership commitment at the not-for-profit level is going to be really important, because we found that top-down is really what makes these projects successful. But ultimately, training and change management and not appreciating the not-for-profit challenges, which tends to be tied to low levels of resourcing and low levels of staffing. All right. So within an ERP selection, a lot of not-for-profits go at it and trying to select solutions that make the most sense for them on their own. So if this is going to be you and you want to prefer a do-it-yourself approach to ERP selections, we want you to be mindful of these common issues. So the first one is difficulty capturing and prioritizing system requirements, which is that it's difficult as a key stakeholder within an NFP to understand what your organization is going to need relative to the features and functionality brought by new software. Unless you're coming from the outside world, it's difficult to know what these new systems can do. So what you tend to do is be overly focused on pain points. The second bullet is related to the first a bit, in that limited knowledge of modern SaaS ERP, which means you tend to set the bar too low for yourself. You don't realize that you should be looking at really every process that you're handling off system, every Excel sheet, every manual piece of paper that you're filling in, and to determine, is a new replacement ERP able to automate this process? So again, you set the bar too low and you end up looking at solutions and demoing software within the bounds of where your future state should be set. Number 3 is risk-averse culture limits decision-making speed. Some people think of that as analysis paralysis, but it really isn't. Is ultimately, we've seen not-for-profits that try to select their own ERP end up making no decision after going through many demos and a down selection and lots of references checking. It ends up being that they decide to do nothing. It's incredibly demoralizing for an organization trying to keep consensus within their team to go through the trouble of 95% of a selection only to stop at the finish line is to say we just can't onboard the risk. So the risk of cost misalignment, SaaS versus existing investment in infrastructure reflects the fact that NFPs tend to have less than cutting edge technology, in many cases still running on on-premise solutions. And as they get closer to making a decision, their IT group, perhaps that's brought in at the last minute, will start to point out challenges. And having a software as a service or a cloud-based product integrating to on-premise technology. And a lot of times there's those hidden costs that appear towards the end that when you're looking at 2 solutions that were firmly within your budget, now are not. Difficulty building consensus across departments is huge. A lot of that comes into that top-down executive sponsorship and leadership, which is, do I have the right people on my team to adequately review, observe demonstrations, prioritize requirements? That's difficult. So what do people do when it's that difficult? They tend to not invite enough key stakeholders across those departments. So the selection team ends up being overly small, 2 or 3 people. And then what happens is none of the departments or operational areas had any say in the selection of a new system, which means they're not fully on board or committed to the success. And the last one is, we've talked before about low staffing levels. Demo fatigue is a real thing. And anybody that's sat through many software demos or been forced to watch a software demo on YouTube or a pre-recorded demonstration where it's not interactive knows that it is a low value add, and you quickly get people that you desperately want their opinion and you want their involvement in the process. They switch off because they see demo after demo, no end in sight. And if we want to see what leads to the risk-adverse culture limits decision-making speed, those 2 things feed each other. If you're slowing down, you're risk-adverse, let's have another demo, in which point your team starts to disperse. See, these are all things. We're not saying you have to use a third-party or trusted advisor to help you choose a new ERP solution. We're just saying, if you're going to do it yourself, go into it eyes wide open so that you know what you're getting into. All right, so the next 2 slides are going to talk about if you're going to do it yourself or if you're going to hire a trusted advisor to help you pick a new solution. There's really 2 ways that we've seen the selection process work. The first is going to be a non-RFP process. So it could be that your procurement rules, because of either spend limits, it could be the state in which you operate, or your constituents or your donors require an RFP at some level of purchase. But what we would tell you to do is to look at the year 1 cost of deployment as well as the annual subscription. And what we would recommend is, if you have a relationship with a trusted advisor, consider doing a non-RFP selection process if you can do it. So what that would mean is that if you're able to have a non-RFP based process, is that it's a streamlined process directed to identified solution providers. So this is where the trusted third party can bring some expertise in understanding your organization. How much is your budget for a new solution? How well does a candidate solution fit? And again, this is an initial selection, non-RFP, which means they may identify 4 to 6 solutions for you that are worthy of consideration. And you can see that little flow chart there is what Cherry Becker uses with projects that we get involved in, where we direct it and we will help identify those initial pool of candidates. Then you'll also see in the that pink, the magenta colored boxes in the bottom left, that there's a down selection to a small number of final candidates that are typically invited on site to do deep dive demos, full day demos. So that's one option that you can do. Those tend to take anywhere from 3 to 4 months to do a final selection. And if you're able to do this based on your procurement rules, we think that these are worth considering. So when an ERP selection requires an RFP, so if there is an RFP that's needed, I think this one says non-RFP process. So in any case, the RFP process is if you need a more formal or robust process. We have 3 different areas here that you can look at there. There's different phases where we have phase 1 might be a requirements definition. Phase 2 could be the RFP development and vendor selection. And then phase 3 can be down there, which is the system implementation support. Those are broken out separately because what we'll find is some of our not-for-profit clients express an interest to do some of the selection themselves, but they need help in certain parts of the project. So what we find is if you are going to use a third party to assist you with an RFP, we would recommend strongly the requirements definition and initial identification. So how do we identify what your organization's requirements are? And then how do we work together to prioritize what your requirements might look like? If that's the case, most NFPs that need to do an RFP are experienced at pushing those RFP documents out and running the rest of it themselves. If that's the case, we're happy to work with you at the beginning in a phase 1 and a requirements definition. But understanding that before you do an RFP, or if you're going to hire a firm to do the RFP for you, is it identified clearly exactly what those steps and phases are? Because you don't want to reach the end of the green section when you go all of this trouble and expense and you end up like one of our NFP clients that I won't name ended up doing all of this and they had 2 responses because of how the RFP was written. Incredibly discouraging because you're expecting many, many high quality responses. So figure out what the plan is and how it would work for you. And if you're using a third party, make sure that they're very clear on how their process works. One big area of recommendation, if I could do this for everyone here, is whether you're doing this for new software, if you're doing this for new gym equipment in your workout room, if you're doing this for a holiday party. You go into it on any of these types of consensus building activities and you prioritize and focus on key requirements. So what does that mean? It means don't try to document every single requirement your organization has. And use a structured approach with clear priority levels for each requirement. So group those requirements together. So we also like prioritization, which is distinguishing between must-have versus nice-to-have features. And then understanding that, how does this help me in a software selection? Well, one is that it lets us group and sort by area and criteria, as you can see there. Also, as I'm interacting with vendors, it helps me keep the vendors' demos focused on what truly matters. The hardest thing when you're doing long demos and selections is an apples to apples comparison, which means if you are not able to create a demo agenda based off of prioritized key requirements, it's so difficult because the vendors will end up demonstrating their software completely different. And it is so difficult for NFPs to score these demos and ultimately down select and pick the best solution for them. So another area that is not just a good idea for informing your vendor of what your expectations are, but also your internal team. So an example, if you look at this, this is a calendar for focusing on a high-level timeline for selection. If you look at the top where we see things like a kickoff meeting, an on-site discovery, and an ERP requirements documentation, this is what Cherry Beckert would do, for example, and going all the way down to the bottom where you're interacting with a chosen vendor with your contract details and you've had your final project meeting. So do you understand as a group, if you're going to do this yourself, or if you're going to use a third party, what does it look like if a selection project is going to run within your organization? Key areas that you have to coordinate are going to be areas where you have discovery calls, initial overview demonstrations, and then final on-site demonstrations. You need to understand when your key team is going to be away on vacation. Perhaps there's seminars or events that they have to cover. It's incredibly discouraging as a vendor, from the vendor side, to be working with an organization. And I just see a really good question from Jen Quindoza, which I can answer in just a moment. There's areas that take multiple weeks to complete, but certain areas, if a vendor's coming on site, you want all of your key stakeholders that are going to be available and attentive, which is why we don't do those virtual. We make sure that the software vendors come on site and are in your boardroom and are doing the demonstration live. That way they have everyone's eyeballs. The overview demos earlier in the process can be remote. In fact, probably should be, because you're dealing with 2 or 4 hours. But the other areas have to be on site. So you want to communicate a calendar like this to your team to make sure that everyone is aligned with vacations, seminars, other dates when your organization could be closed. So I want to go back to Jen's question earlier about, can this be done with, can Cherry Bekaert do these for our own clients when we also are providing audit and test services? So the answer is 100% yes. And in fact, I joined Cherry Bekaert in 2017. And at the time, there was no CFO advisory or tech advisory at all. So 100% of the clients that I was working with for about 18 months were all audit clients. So the flow chart that you saw there earlier, whether it's RFP or non-RFP, was all designed to be done for an attest client. So the differences there is that we don't pre-select or make decisions on your behalf. So what we do is we make sure that the scoring templates, scoring models, reference checks are all done with your team's participation. And that way that if we're doing scorecards, the top scoring candidate compared to the second top scoring candidate, the reason that one's higher than the other is that it's your organization's scoring model. It's our template, but the weights with regards to fit versus cost versus timeline versus references versus cloud strategy is all based on how important your organization thinks it is. So if there's any questions about that, we have so many audit clients that we can reference you to, or if there's questions about specific areas you might be concerned with, certainly those are things that we can talk about. But that's a great question, and we probably get that question once or twice a week. So common failure points and migration. So what are these things that come up within a project that absolutely can take this sideways? So what we'll tell you is where ERP implementations fail are these areas, and it tends to be close to go live, which means 2/3 to 3/4 of the project, things look like they're going well. But when it comes up to testing or user acceptance testing, we don't see so much as skipping testing, so much as false positives, which means users are busy, they don't have time to test. So what happens is that testing occurs by not the end users, but by department heads. And the department heads are not the ones that are operating the software on a day-to-day basis. And what testing does happen is not enough and overly simplistic. So it's not a model of the complex transactions that you're going to use at go live. Poor data migration tends to be one of a big barrier towards getting valuable reports out of the system, which is data cleaning is incredibly complex, difficult to do, and takes a lot of thought. And what ends up happening, I would say 50% of the time, is our NFP clients end up taking the data out of their old system, loading it into the new system without that careful scrutiny. So this is one area, by the way, that if you're a Cherry Bekaert audit client, we are very limited on what we can do with data transformation. But we certainly have some templates that can provide you some coaching. But that's one area that we're not able to support, is loading in the financial data. But we do so many ERP rescue and recoveries, working with clients with failed projects. Many times the clients tell us that, I wish I would have known that when I load this data in, that after I'm live, I can't get that dirty data back out. Inadequate training, something that we'd like you to think about is there's two types of training. There is key user training, or the power users getting trained. And then there's end user training. So what I'll tell you is that most of the providers don't put that in their statement of work to do end user training. They skip that part. And they say it's train the trainer. You're going to train your own people. And what I find is that it's important for your key stakeholders and department heads to be capable in the software, but your experts have to be the people that do it day to day, and they usually get skipped. Lack of change management. This is more of an organizational structure capability that needs to be brought in. So think of whether it's changing health insurance plans, if it's changing banks, if it's changing ERP systems. All of these areas, if your organization struggles with change, generally speaking, this is a big organizational change that can be quite disruptive. So consider reaching out to change management organizations. These are things that Cherry Beckert can do to assist clients, and we can even package these in a audit and a test friendly, independence friendly package that does less of the management part and does more of the training and coaching.
All right, we have another polling question for everybody. What ERP system do you currently use? You may not use any of these, so you can select other. If so, I know Banner, as an example, is pretty common in the not-for-profit world. And there's some others that are not on this list, but look forward to seeing what sorts of products you use out there. We work, Jim and I work, and the team work with several different products to either go to them or get folks off of them. See the results here. Other. All right. So yeah, this list maybe wasn't very reflective of what this community has, but let's move on. So this chart essentially lays out the typical steps that you'll go through in ERP implementation. A little different than what Jim walked through with us helping with the requirements gathering process and selecting a vendor. But after you select an SI, you'll kick off the meeting, you'll go through the discovery. So that'll be validation of the requirements that you gathered initially, or that a trusted advisor helped gathered, and you'll conduct a series of workshops to validate those and then make sure that the scope is clear before you start your design and building. Then you go through the configuration, and that's essentially setting up the system in various waves or stages so that it aligns with all of your requirements. And we call that configuration. And typically in configuration, you'll have conference room pilots or demonstrations, which show you, how each of your various stages of requirements are developed and integrated. And you'll have a chance to look at those, validate it, and approve it before you ultimately go. And that's all done typically in a test environment. Jim talked about test, sandbox, and production. Before you go into production, that's replacing your old system. You go through user acceptance testing. And that is the process where your users go through, and you'll have various test scripts. A test script will say, how do I pay a vendor? Or how do I pay one of my people? Or how do I run a quarterly financial report or statement? And those things will be tested by your users and validated. You'll identify what passes, what fails. And then for those that fail, do some reconfiguration. And then ultimately you move to deployment. This process can really vary. It depends upon the complexity of your organization and what you're trying to implement. On the low end, you might be able to implement a product in 3 to 4 months. On the high end, if you're a larger organization and you move to an enterprise class ERP, it could take 18 months or more. So that's a little background on the process. Now you have a team structure, so you're going to need to set up your own internal team. These are some of the roles that we typically recommend. Your system integrator, and if you have a project management office support, will help guide you here. But typically, you'll want to have executive stakeholders involved in the project for approvals and keep them aware of how things are progressing. We like to set up a multi-tiered governance structure with an executive team, a project steering committee. These tend to be the department heads, and then working teams, project teams that are your functional experts. If you want to set up GL or AP or AR, you bring in those SMEs and experts. So they're all involved in the process. We also think it's important to have champions. So these are folks who can help advocate for the project and work to promote it. That really helps with change management. We do a lot of change management on ERP implementations of large enterprise class solutions like Oracle. And it's important to make sure that you identify champions who can help with that and provide the right level of engagement. If you do have a partner that helps you, you need to make sure that you guys are speaking the same language. You know how long they've been in the business. Have they ever implemented this type of software before? And you certainly definitely want to check references. The other thing is, are the folks working on the project employees, or are they independent contractors? Not that there's anything wrong with independent contractors, but the tenure between an independent contractor and the system integrator may be very short. They may not have worked together before, and that can create some risk in your implementation. And then knowledge transfer, I think, is critically important. The sales team is great. Everything's perfect. Once they're there and the system can do anything, and then they sort of turn their backs and hand it off to the implementation team. And sometimes what you shared with the sales team doesn't get to the integrators. And so you have to repeat yourselves and things can get dropped. So that knowledge transfer is critically important as well. We're going to talk a little bit about some critical foundational elements, and I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. Stakeholder commitment, talked about that. Who are the key stakeholders in the organization that are going to be using this and will serve as the project champions? Who are we going to assign to support this implementation? It is going to take a lot of time for your teams and subject matter experts. If this is a financial system, your CFO, their direct reports that lead each of the core teams, financial reporting, GL, AP, asset management are going to need to be involved, and it's very difficult for them to do this plus their day jobs. So you may want to think about backfill strategies. And come up with a plan for how much time folks are going to be spending on this. Project governance, I alluded to that before. So executive steering committee, you want an internal project manager on your team that can do this. You don't just want to rely on the project manager for a trusted advisor if you use them, or an integrator to manage the project. You need to have your own. And finally, change management, which we've talked about before. I think that this is critically important so that we can make sure that you're communicating effectively to the team and letting end users know why you're doing this, how they're going to be impacted, getting their input into the process, and training them effectively. This is where a lot of projects fail. We've got some background on data migration strategy. So typically, this is a big point of failure as well. Jim alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there's some typical steps that you need to go through. Everybody wants to move all the data over into the new system. You're in a cloud-based system, you pay for storage. You don't necessarily need to do that. You could create a data warehouse and store that outside of it and bring over a couple years worth of data so that you can access that and run reports as needed. But I don't fall into the trap of thinking you need to move everything over. And then once you're extracting that data from the legacy software, you're going to have some mapping to do, and the conversions can be difficult. And you need to have a data dictionary, because the way your old system was organized and fields were structured and data was referred to may be different than in the modern. It's likely to be different than the modern system. So make sure that you effectively map that and go through a phased data conversion approach here. Cutover is equally important. We go through the plan development process that will but it's essentially go through the process of turning the switch from the old system to the new system. You will run parallel testing, especially with payroll. We recommend 3 parallel payroll runs so you can make sure that people's pay stubs in that sandbox environment are accurate. It's testing, and everyone's comfortable with the test results. And then we go through those steps before we actually move over into the cutover process. Post-implementation success, I think here are some items to keep in mind as you go through. We deal with your support model. How much support are you getting from your SI? How are you going to support the system when they go away? The software vendor typically has some level of support, but you may need more than that, especially if you have integrations to third-party solutions that are outside that software. So this chart, which you'll get a copy of, and we can't go into detail right now on because we're running out of time, will give you some good steps to go through as you go through post-implementation success. And then we have an overview of the variety of different training solutions that you can get offered. Jim talked about SIs typically offering train the in-trainer, which is great, that instructor-led training, but many software companies have their own universities that you can log into for self-paced training, which is great. Even certification programs for your more technical team, and a variety of learning packages. But when we go in and do post-implementation reviews, the lack of training is often one of the biggest gaps and primary reasons for failures that we see. So don't change yourself on training. And then finally, support services. Find out what your post-implementation support is, what sorts of self-service resources exist, tiered support structure, and then how long it's going to last and what you may receive. And support may not cover everything. As I alluded to, advanced customizations, third-party integrations tend to be out of scope. So make sure that you're clear on that. And I think that was sorry about the quick pace for the end there, but I think that is a wrap for us. We have one final polling question. Take some time to answer that. And then for anyone who wants to stay on, because I think we are at time, Jim and I would be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us on this last virtual conference session.
Yeah,
I don't know.
thanks so.
Yep.
Thanks so much, George or Jim. I know there was a couple questions in the Q&A. If somewhere about you'll be getting your CP certificate within 10 days. The slides will be coming within 5 to 10 days. There might have been one technical question in there, though. You guys, I know we're a minute over, but if you want to look at that, and if not, I'll just start wrapping up again. Yeah, like George said, thanks so much for everyone attending over the last 2 days for our virtual conference. Don't hesitate to follow up with George or Jim with any specific questions. When you close out, please take the survey. We appreciate the feedback. And for details of upcoming webinars, events, and latest insights, please visit us at cbh.com. There's a lot of information there for the nonprofit site. So don't hesitate to go over there anytime to look into it. And otherwise, we wish everybody a great rest of the day and a good Friday tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Bye all. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.